Chapter 4 of The Jungle Girl by Gordon Casserly. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Linda Marie Nielsen, Vancouver, BC. A crocodile intervenes. Major Norton opened his mouth to cry a warning, but Wargrave grasped his arm and said hurriedly, "Don't shout, sir. Don't wake her. She'll be too confused to move." He then thrust his field glasses into the adjutant's hand. "Watch for the strike of my bullet, Ray," he said. He threw himself at full length on the ground and pressed a cartridge into the breech of his rifle. His companion stood over him as he cast a hurried glance forward and adjusted his sight, muttering, "Just about 400 yards." The crocodile was nearly broadside on to him, and even at that distance he could see the scaly armor covering head, back, and sides that would defy any bullet. The unprotected spot behind the shoulder was hidden from him. The only vulnerable part was the neck. Wargrave laid his cheek to the butt and sighted on this. The crocodile crept on inch by inch, dragging its limbs forward with the slow, stealthy movement of its kind when stalking their prey on land. The horrified watchers saw that the terrible snout with its protruding fangs was barely a yard from Mrs. Norton's feet. Raymond's hands holding the glasses to his eyes trembled violently. The resident shook as with the palsy, and he stared in horror at the crawling death that threatened the sleeping woman. Wargrave fired. As the rifle rang out, the creeping movement ceased. "You've hit him, I swear!" cried Raymond. "I didn't see the bullet strike the ground." Wargrave rapidly worked the bolt of his rifle, jerking out the empty case and pushing a fresh cartridge into the chamber. He fired again. "That's got him! That must have got him!" exclaimed Raymond. The crocodile lay still. Frank leapt to his feet, and, rifle in hand, dashed down the incline. At that moment Mrs. Norton awoke, turned on her side, raised her body a little, and suddenly saw the horrible reptile. She sat up rigid with terror and stared at it. The brute slowly opened his huge mouth and disclosed the cruel gapped teeth. Then the iron jaws clashed together. With a shriek, the woman sprang to her feet, but stood trembling, unable to move away. "Run! Run!" shouted Wargrave, springing down the slope towards her. Behind him raced Raymond, while her husband, who was unable to run fast, followed far behind. Mrs. Norton seemed rooted to the spot, but she turned to Wargrave with outstretched arms and gasped, "Save me, Frank! Save me!" With a bound he reached her, and, as she clung to him convulsively, panted out, "It's all right, dear. You're safe now." He pushed her behind him, and bringing the rifle to his shoulder, faced the crocodile. The brute opened and shut its great jaws, seeming to gasp for air, while a strange whistling sound came from its throat. Its body appeared to be paralyzed. "It can't move. You've broken its spine," cried Raymond, as he reached them. "Your first shot it must have been. Look, your second's torn its throat." He pointed to the neck and went round to the other side. From a jagged, gaping wound where the expanding bullet had torn the throat, the blood spurted and air whistled out with a shrill sound. Wargrave turned to Violet and took the terrified woman, who seemed on the point of fainting, in his arms. "All right, little girl, it's all right. The brute's done for." She pulled herself together with an effort and looked nervously at the crocodile. Then she released herself from Frank's clasp and said, smiling feebly, "What a coward I am! I'm ashamed of myself. Where's John? Oh, here he is. Doesn't he look funny?" The resident, very red faced and out of breath, had slowed down into a shambling walk and was puffing and blowing like a grampus. As he came up to them he sputtered, "Is it safe? Is it dead?" "It's harmless now, sir," answered Raymond. "It's still living, but it can't move. The spine's broken, I think." The resident turned to his wife. The poor man had been in agony while she was in danger, but now that the peril had paused he could only express his relief in irritable scolding. "How could you be so foolish, Violet?" he asked crossly. "The idea of going to sleep near the tank! Most unwise. You might have been eaten alive." His wife smiled bitterly and glanced at the grumbling man with a contemptuous expression on her face. "Yes, John, very inconsiderate of me, I dare say. But how was I to know that there was a mugger (crocodile) in the tank?" Then for the first time she realized the nearness of the water. "Good gracious! I thought I was much farther. How did I get so close to it? Did I slip down in my sleep?" "No, there are the trees," said Raymond. "It's extraordinary. The whole tank seems to have shifted." The resident was mopping his bald scalp and lifted his hat to let the gusty wind cool his head. A sudden squall blew the big pith sun helmet out of his hand. Wargrave caught it in the air and returned it to its owner. "By Jove, it's a regular gale," he said. "I think I know what's happened. This wind's so strong that it's blown the water of the tank before it and actually shifted the whole mass 30 or 40 yards this way." "Yes, I've known that to occur before with shallow ponds," said Raymond. "I've heard the passage of the Red Sea by the Israelites and the drowning of Pharaoh's army explained the same way. It's said that the crossing really took place at one extremity of the Bitter Lake through which the Suez Canal passes." Major Norton was staring at the far end of the tank now left bare. "There may be some interesting insects stranded on the bottom, uncovered by the receding water," he said abstractedly, and was moving away to search for them when Wargrave said disgustedly, "Don't you think, sir, that, as Mrs. Norton has had such a shock, the sooner we get off the better?" "Yes, yes, very true. But you can order the camels to be saddled while I'm having a look," replied the enthusiastic collector. "I really must go and see. There may be some very interesting specimens there." And he hurried away. His wife smiled rather bitterly as he went. Then she turned to the two subalterns. "But tell me what happened. How did the mugger come here? How was I saved?" Raymond rapidly narrated what had taken place. Violet looked at Wargrave with glistening eyes and held out her hands to him. "So you saved my life. How can I thank you?" she said gratefully. Her lips trembled a little. Frank took her hands in his but answered lightly, "Oh, it was nothing. Anyone else would have done the same. I happened to be the only one with a rifle." Raymond turned away quickly and walked over to the crocodile. Neither of them took any notice of him. Violet gazed fondly at Wargrave. I owe you so much, Frank, so very much, she murmured in a low voice. You've made my life worth living, and now you make me live. He was embarrassed, but he pressed the hands he held in his. He then released them and tried to speak lightly. Shall I have the mugger skinned and get a dressing bag made out of his hide for you? He said, smiling. That'd be a nice souvenir of the brute. She shuddered. I don't want to remember him, she cried, turning to glance at the crocodile. Horrid beast! I can't bear the sight of him. The mugger certainly looked a most repulsive brute as it lay stretched on the ground, its jaws occasionally opening, shutting spasmodically, the blood from its wounded throat spreading in a pool on the sun-baked earth. It was evidently an old beast, and skull and back were covered with thick horny plates and bosses through which no bullet could penetrate. The big teeth studded irregularly in the cruel jaws were yellow and worn, as were the thick nails tipping the claws at the ends of the powerful limbs. The devil's not dead yet. Shall I put another bullet into him? Said Wargrave. It's only wasting a cartridge, replied his friend. He can't do any more harm. When the men come we'll have him cut open and see what he's got inside him. Violet shuddered. Oh, do you think he has ever eaten any human being? She asked, gazing with loathing at the huge reptile. Judging from the way he stalked you, I should think he has, answered Raymond. Hello! Here comes one of the camel drivers with some of the villagers. They'll be able to tell us about him. On the rim of the basin appeared a group of natives moving in their direction. Suddenly they caught sight of the crocodile, stopped and pointed to it, and began to talk excitedly. One of the local peasants ran back shouting. The rest hurried down for a closer view of the reptile. A chorus of wonder rose from them as they stood round it. The Mohammedan camel driver exclaimed in Hindustani, Awi Bahai, Kia Janwar, Puka Shaitan. A brother, what an animal! A veritable devil! As the villagers spoke only the dialect of the state, Raymond used this man as interpreter and questioned them about the crocodile. They asserted that it had inhabited the tank for many years, hundreds, said one man. It had, to their certain knowledge, killed several women incautiously bathing or drawing water from the tank. As women are not valued highly by the poorer Hindus, this did not make the mugger very unpopular. But early in that very year it had committed the awful crime of dragging under water and devouring a Brahmani bull, an animal devoted to the gods and held sacrosanct. By this time the crocodile had breathed his last. Raymond measured it roughly and found it to be over 12 feet in length. The peasants turned the great body on its back. Wargrave saw that the skin underneath was too thick to be made into leather, so he bade them cut the belly open. The stomach contained many shells of freshwater crabs and crayfish, as well as a surprising amount of large pebbles, either taken for digestive purposes or swallowed when the fish were being scooped up off the bottom. But further search resulted in the finding of several heavy brass or copper anklets and amulets, such as are worn by Indian women. Some have evidently been a long time in the reptile's interior. When the camels had come and the party was preparing to mount and start back home, a crowd of villagers, led by their old priest, bore down upon them. Learning that Frank was the slayer of the sacrilegious crocodile, the holy man hung a garland of marigolds round his neck, and through the interpreter offered him the thanks of gods and men for his good deed, and to a chorus of blessings and compliments he rode away with his companions. So ended the incident, apparently, but consequences undreamed of by any of the actors in it flowed from it, for imperceptibly it brought a change into the relations between Mrs. Norton and Wargrave, and eventually altered them completely. At first, it merely seemed to strengthen their friendship and increase the feeling of intimacy. To Violet, they were Violet and Frank to each other now. The saving of her life constituted a bond that could never be severed. He had preserved her from a horrible death, and she owed Wargrave more than gratitude. Hitherto she had often toyed with the idea of him as a lover, and the thought had been a pleasant one, but it had hardly occurred to her to be in love with him in return. In all her life up to now she had never known what it was to really love. She had married without affection. Her girlhood had been passed without the mildest flirtation, for she had been brought up in a quiet country village where there never seemed to be any bachelors of her own class between the ages of 17 and 50. Even the curate was gray haired and married. She had made up for this deprivation during the voyage out to India and her season in Calcutta. But although she found many men ready to flirt with her, Norton's proposal was the only serious one that she had, and she accepted him in desperation. She had never felt any love for him. She did not realize that he had any for her, for although he really entertained a sincere affection of a kind for her, it was so seldom and so badly expressed that she was never aware of its existence. Since her marriage she had had several careless flirtations during her visits to her relatives in Calcutta, but her heart was not seriously affected. She never acknowledged to herself that any gratitude or loyalty was due from her to her husband. On the contrary, she felt that she owed him, as well as fate, a grudge. She was young, warm-blooded, of a passionate temperament, yet she found herself wedded to a man who apparently needed a housekeeper, not a wife. Her husband did not appear to realize that a woman is not essentially different to a man, that she has feelings, desires, passions, just as he has. Although by a polite fiction the prudish Anglo-Saxon races seem to agree to regard her as of a more spiritual, more ethereal, and less earthy a nature. Yet it is only a fiction after all. Violet was a living woman, a creature of flesh and blood, who was not content to be a chattel, a household ornament, a piece of furniture. It was not to be wondered at that she longed to enter into woman's kingdom, to exercise the power of her sex to sway the other and to experience the thrill of the realization of that power. Often in her loneliness she pined to see eyes she loved look with love into hers. She was not a marble statue. It was but natural that she should long for love, a lover, the clasp of strong arms, the pressure of a man's broad chest against her bosom, the feel of burning kisses on her lips, the glorious surrender of her whole being to some adored one to whom she was the universe, who lived but for her. Now, for the first time in her life, her errant dreams took concrete shape. At last she began to feel the companionship of a particular man necessary for her happiness. She had never before realized the pleasure, the joy, to be derived from the presence of one of the opposite sex who was in sympathy, in perfect harmony with her nature. In her lonely hours, and they were many, she thought constantly of Wargrave. His face was ever before her, his voice sounding in her ears. She usually saw her husband, absorbed in his work and studies, only at meals, and as she looked across the table at him, then she could not help contrasting the heavy, unattractive man sitting silent, usually reading a book while he ate, with the good looking, laughter loving playfellow who had come into her life. She learned to daydream of Wargrave, to watch for his coming and hate his going, to enjoy every moment of his presence. He had brought a new interest into her hitherto purposeless life, the life he had preserved and that consequently seemed to belong to him. New feelings awakened in her. The world was a happier, brighter place than it had been. It pleased her to realize what it all meant, to know that the novel sensations, the fluttering hopes and fears, the strange, delightful thrills, were all symptoms of that longed for malady that comes sooner or later to all women. She knew at last that she loved Wargrave and gloried in the knowledge, and she never doubted that he loved her in return. Did he? It was hard to tell. To a man the thought of love in the abstract seldom occurs, and the realization of the concrete fact that he is in love with some particular woman generally comes somewhat as a shock. He is by nature a lover of freedom, and in theory at least resents fetters, even silken ones, and Wargrave had never thought of analyzing his feelings towards Violet. He was not a professional amorist and, although not a Puritan, would never set himself deliberately to make love to a married woman under her husband's roof. He was fond of Mrs. Norton as a sister, he thought. She was a delightful friend, a real pal. So understanding, so companionable. He said to himself frequently, it had not occurred to him that his feelings for her might be love. He had often before been on terms of friendship with women, married and single, but none of them had ever attracted him as much as she did. He had never felt any desire to be married. Domesticity did not appeal to him, but now, as he watched Violet moving about her drawing room or playing to him, he found himself thinking that it would be pleasant to return to his bungalow from parade and find a pretty little wife waiting to greet him with a smile and a kiss. And the wife of his dreams always had Violet's face, wore smart, well cut frocks like Violet's, and showed just such shapely, silken clad legs and ankles and such small feet in dainty silver-buckled high-heeled shoes, and he thought, with an inward groan, that such a luxury was not for a debt-ridden subaltern like him, that his heavy mortgaged pay would not run to expensive gowns, silk stockings, and costly footwear. Yet it never occurred to him that Violet cared for him, nor did it enter his mind to try to win her love, but he felt that he would do much to make her happy, that saving her life made him in a way responsible for it in future, and he knew that she was not a contented woman. His sympathy went out to her for what he guessed she must suffer from her ill assorted union. But soon he had no need to surmise it, for before long Violet began to confide all her sorrows to him, and the recital made his heart bleed for one so young and beautiful mated to a selfish wretch who as blind to her suffering as he was to her charm. The younger man's chivalry was up in arms, and he felt that such a boor did not deserve so bright a jewel. At times Frank was tempted to confront the callous husband and force him to open his dulled eyes to the bravely borne misery of his neglected wife, and realize how fortunate he ought to consider himself in being the owner of such a transcendent being. But the next moment the infatuated youth was convinced that Norton was incapable of appreciating so rare a woman, that only a nature like his own could understand or do full justice to the perfections of hers. Such is a young man's conceit. He rejoiced to know that his poor sympathy could help in a measure to make up to Violet for the happiness that she declared that she had missed in life, and so he gladly consented to play the consoler, and she, for the pleasure of being consoled, continued to pour out her griefs to him. But if Frank was unconscious of the danger of his post as sympathizing confidant to another man's young and pretty wife, others were not. Her husband, of course, was as blind as most husbands seem to be in Anglo Indian society, for in that land of the household of three, the eternal triangle, it is almost a recognized principle that every married woman who is at all attractive is entitled to have one particular bachelor always in close attendance on her, to be constantly at her beck and call, to ride with her, to drive her every afternoon to tennis or golf or watch polo, then on to the club and sit with her there. His duty, a pleasant one, no doubt, is to cheer up her otherwise solitary dinner in her bungalow on the nights when her neglectful husband is dining out en garçon. No cavaliere servant of old Italy ever had so busy a time as the tame cat of the India of to day. And the husband allows it, nay seems, as Major Norton did, to hail his presence with relief, as it eases the conscience of the selfish lord and master who leaves his spouse much alone. But if the resident saw no harm or danger in the young officer constantly seeking the society of his pretty wife, others did. At first Frank's well wishers tried to hint to him that there was likelihood of his friendship with her being misunderstood, but he laughed at Raymond's badly expressed warning, and rather resented Major Hepburn's kindly advice when on one occasion His company commander spoke plainly, though tactfully, to him on the subject. Then Violet's enemies took a hand in the game. Mrs. Trevor, having failed to decoy him to her bungalow for what she called a quiet tea and a motherly little chat, concerned him one afternoon when he was on his way to the Residency, and spoke very openly to him of the risk he ran of being entangled in the coils of such an outrageous coquette as that Mrs. Norton, as she termed her. Frank was so indignant at her abuse of his friend that for the first time in his life he was rude to a woman and snubbed Mrs. Trevor so severely that she went in a rage to her husband and insisted on taking immediate steps to arrest the progress of a scandal that, she declared, would attract the unfavorable attention of the higher military authorities to the regiment. "Do you realize, William, that you will be the one to suffer?" said the angry woman. "If anything happens, if Major Norton complains, if that shameless creature succeeds in making that foolish young man run away with her, you will be blamed. You can't afford it. You know that the General's confidential report on you last year was not too favorable." "It wasn't really bad, my dear. It only hinted that I lacked decision," pleaded the henpecked man. "Exactly. You are not firm enough," persisted his domestic tyrant. "They will say that you should have put your foot down at once and stopped this disgraceful affair." "But what can I do?" asked the Colonel helplessly. "Someone ought to speak to Major Norton at once." "Oh, my dear Jane, I couldn't. I daren't. For two pins I'd do it myself. Mrs. Baird said the other day that it was our duty as respectable women." "No, no, no, Jane, you mustn't think of it!" exclaimed the alarmed man. "I forbid you. You mustn't mix yourself up in the affair. It would be committing me." "Then send that impertinent young man away," said Mrs. Trevor firmly. "No general would have accused her of lack of decision. I used to have a high opinion of him once, but after his insolence to me I believe him to be nearly as bad as the woman." "Where can I send him?" asked the worried Colonel. "He has done all the courses and passed all the classes and examinations he can." "I know you have only to write confidentially to the staff and inform them that young Wargrave's removal to another station is absolutely necessary to prevent a scandal, and they'll send him off somewhere else at once." Her husband nodded his head. He was well aware of the fact that the army in India looks closely after the behaviour and morals of its officers, that a colonel has only to hint that the transfer of a particular individual under his command is necessary to stop a scandal, and without loss of time that officer finds himself deported to the other side of the country. One morning, a week after Mrs. Trevor's conversation with her husband, Wargrave, superintending the musketry of his double company on the rifle range, was given an official note from the adjutant informing him that the commanding officer desired to see him at once in the orderly room. As Major Hepburn was not present, Frank handed the men over to the senior Indian Company commander, and rode off to the regimental office, wondering as he went what could be the reason of the sudden summons. Reaching the building, he found Raymond on the watch for him, while ostensibly engaged in criticising to the battalion Dursey tailor the fit of the new uniforms of several recruits. "I say, Ray, what's up?" asked his friend cheerily, as he swung himself out of the saddle. The adjutant nodded warningly towards the orderly room and dropped his voice as he replied: "I don't know, old chap. The C.O. said nothing to me, but he's in there with Hepburn trying to work himself up into a rage so that he can bullyrag you properly. You'd better go in and get it over." Wargrave entered the big, colour washed room. The colonel was seated at his desk, frowning at a paper before him, and did not look up. Major Hepburn was standing behind his chair, and glanced commiseratingly at the subaltern. Frank stood to attention and saluted. "Good morning, sir," he said. "You wanted to see me?" Colonel Trevor did not reply, but turning slightly in his chair, said: "Major Hepburn, call in the adjutant, please." As the second in command went out on the veranda and summoned Raymond, Wargrave's heart misgave him. He had no idea of what the matter was, but the colonel's manner and presence of the second in command were ominous signs. He wondered what crime he was going to be charged with. "Shut the doors, Raymond," said the commanding officer curtly, as the adjutant entered. The latter did so and sat down at his writing table, glancing anxiously at his friend. Colonel Trevor's lips were twitching nervously, and he seemed to experience a difficulty in finding his voice. At last he took up a paper from his desk and said: "Mr. Wargrave, this is a telegram just received from Western Army Headquarters. It says Lieutenant Wargrave is appointed to Number 12 Battalion, Frontier Military Police. Direct him to proceed forthwith to report to O.C. Detachment, Ranga Duar, Eastern Bengal." End of chapter 4.